Right, hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf. We are continuing on powering through the lectures on the proofs of God, and we are now going to go into the teleological proof. We've already gone over the cosmological proof. If you want to know what that's about, just check out the prior videos on the playlist. But anyways, I'm curious about what the issue with this one is going to be, besides the regular issues we see in it. So this is from the 1831 lectures on the philosophy of religion. Well, you know, why make something new when you already worked it out in other places, right? Kant has already criticized this proof too, like the other proofs of God's existence, and he has in large measure destroyed their reputation, so that it is now hardly considered worthwhile to examine the proofs themselves at all carefully. Yet Kant himself says of this proof that it deserves at all times to be treated with respect. When he adds that the teleological proof is the oldest, however, he is mistaken. The first definition of God is that God is power. It is only later that God is defined as wisdom. Moreover, this proof first occurs among the Greeks. It was formulated by Socrates. Socrates makes purposiveness, especially in the form of the good, the basic principle of reason. The reason for his imprisonment is, according to him, that the Athenians have deemed it good. Even historically, therefore, this proof coincides with the development of freedom. Okay, that's interesting. First definition of God is that God is power. We have already considered the transition from the religion of power to the religion of spirituality in general, the same mediating process that we recognize in the religion of beauty. We have also encountered already in the intermediate stages. But in these stages, it is still interpreted in a manner devoid of spirit. Now that this transition to the religion of spirituality has introduced a further essential determination, we must first identify and demonstrate it in abstract fashion. We have here the category of freedom as such, the definition of an activity of freedom, a creating in accord with freedom, no longer an unrestrained creation in accord with power, but in accord with purposes. Freedom is determining oneself, and what is active to the extent that it determines itself inwardly, implicitly has self-determination as its purpose. Power is simply self-projection in such a way that there is something unreconciled in what is projected. It is, to be sure, implicitly a mirror image, but it is not yet explicit in consciousness that, in its creature, what creates is merely preserving and bringing forth itself, so that in the creature the characteristics of the divine are themselves present. God is here grasped under the defining characteristic of wisdom, of purposive activity. Power is benevolent and just, but it is only purposive action that has this defining mark of rationality, that from action only what is already determined in advance emerges, that is, this identity of the Creator with itself. What constitutes the diversity of the proofs of God's existence is just the diversity of their defining categories. There is in each of them a mediation, a starting point, and a point of arrival. In the teleological and physico-theological proof, the defining category of purposiveness attaches both to the starting point and to the conclusion. The proof begins from a mode of being that is now defined as purposive, and what is thereby mediated is God as positing and activating the purpose. The being that, as immediate, is the starting point of the cosmological proof is, to begin with, a manifold contingent being. God is then defined as necessity that has being in and for itself, the power over the contingent. The higher specification here is that purposiveness is present in contingent being. In this purpose, rationality is already explicit as a free, self-determining and activating of this contingent content to the end that, although as purpose, it is initially something inward, it should be realized in reality should correspond to the concept or to the purpose. A thing is good insofar as it fulfills its definition, its purpose. This means that the reality matches the concept or the definition. We can perceive in the world a concordance of external things, things that are present without reference to one another and come into existence on their own account, quite accidentally as far as the others are concerned, and having no essential connection with each other. Yet, although these things are quite separate from one another, a unity shows itself by virtue of which they are directly in conformity with one another. Kant describes this in detail as follows. The world that we are in offers us an immense spectacle of multiplicity, order, purposiveness, etc. This purposive character is particularly apparent in living matter, both inwardly and in its connection with the external environment. Both the human and the animal organisms are implicitly a manifold, with just these limbs, internal organs, etc. Although they seem to subsist merely side by side, it is everywhere just the general purposive definition that maintains them. The one exists only through the other and for the other, and all human limbs and components are merely means for the self-preservation of the individual, which is here the purpose. The human organism, or living matter in general, has a multitude of requirements. Air, nourishment, light, etc. are necessary for its preservation. All this is present on its own account, and the capacity to serve a purpose is something external to it. The animals, meat, air, etc. that human beings need do not in themselves have the express character of being purposes. Yet the one is purely and simply a means for the other. There is here an inner coherence which is necessary but which does not exist as such. This inner coherence is not brought about by the objects themselves, but is produced by something other than what these things themselves are. Purposiveness does not come about by itself. The purposive activity is extraneous to the things, and this implicit and self-positing harmony is the power over these things, which determines that they shall stand in a purposive orientation to one another. Thus, the world is no longer an aggregate of contingent things, but a mass of purposive connections, but the connections accrue to the things themselves from outside. This purposive connection must have a cause, and a cause that is full of power and wisdom. This purposive activity and this cause is God. According to Kant, this proof is the clearest and is intelligible to the ordinary man. Through it, nature has, for the first time, a moral interest. It brings the study of nature to life, just as it is from that study that it derives. This is, in general terms, the teleological proof. Kant's critique now is as follows. He argues that the first deficiency of this proof is that only the form of things enters into consideration here. The purposive relation concerns only the definition of the form. Everything maintains itself, and hence it is not merely a means for something else, but a purpose unto itself, and that by virtue of which a thing can be a means concerns only its form, not its matter. The sole conclusion to be drawn, therefore, would be that there is a form-giving cause, but this cause does not also bring forth matter. Thus the proof, says Kant, does not fulfill the idea of God, that God is the creator of the matter, not merely of the form. Form contains the determinations that relate to one another, whereas matter is supposedly what is formless and so devoid of connections. Accordingly, in Kant's view, this proof yields only a demiurge, one who shapes the material. It does not yield the creator. In respect to this criticism, it can be said at least that all relation is form. This is how form is separated off from matter. We can see that God's activity would consequently be a finite one, for if we produce something technical, we must take the material for it from outside. In this way, our activity is limited, finite, and matter is thus posited as subsisting on its own account or as eternal. That whereby things are turned against their other is their qualities, their form, not their subsistence of the things as such. No, not the subsistence of the things as such. Their subsistence is their matter. To begin with, this is right enough to be sure that the relations between things pertain to their form. But the question is whether this distinction, this separation between form and matter, is admissible, whether we can put everything on the one side or on the other, in this particular way. On the contrary, we have shown in the Logic, Encyclopedia section 129, that matter without form is an absurdity, a pure abstraction of the understanding, one that we can indeed construct but should not be given out to be something true. The matter that is set up against God as something unchangeable is merely a product of reflection. To put it another way, this identity of formlessness, this continuous unity of matter, is itself a formal determination. Hence, we have to recognize that the matter that is here put on one side does itself belong to the other side, the side of form. But in that case, form is identical with itself too. It relates to itself, and in so doing is identical with itself too. It relates to itself, and in so doing it has just the self-subsistence that is differentiated as matter. The activity of God itself, simple unity with itself, form is matter. Thus there is this subsistence, this abiding unity with self, with respect to the form, so that it relates to itself, and this is its subsistence, the very thing that matter is. Seems that the translator got lazy here for most of these lectures. God is always being referred to as a God self, not himself, not itself. I almost got used to it. Okay, the activity of God itself, simple unity with itself, form is matter. Thus there is this subsistence, this abiding unity with self with respect to the form, so that it relates to itself, and this is its subsistence, the very thing that matter is. So there is no form without matter or vice versa, rather they are both the same. Okay, I'm going to have to read back up a little bit because that kind of went over my head right now. Alright, going to start from the top of the page. The matter that is set up against God as something unchangeable is merely a product of reflection. To put it another way, this identity is formlessness. This continuous unity of matter is itself a formal determination. Hence, we have to recognize that the matter that is here put on one side does itself belong to the other side, the side of form. But in that case, form is identical with itself too. It relates itself to itself, and in so doing, it has just the self-subsistence that is differentiated as matter. Okay, so what I understand of this is that the very distinction of matter from form is itself a formal distinction, because we've already established earlier that that whereby things are turned against their other is their qualities, their form, not the subsistence of the thing as such. So if this is the definition of form, the very distinction of matter as matter is a formal distinction, and therefore the distinction collapses. Does that make sense? Somebody let me know, because that makes sense to me, but I'm not entirely sure if I'm putting that in an intelligible manner.
The way I think of it is like, if you have form, then matter is something inert and independent, so to speak, that the form can shape. So form exists only in the shape, so to speak. But matter, if it is independent or for itself, then it is its form of matter, so to speak. When we attempt to give it that independence from form, it just becomes a form on its end as well.
Yeah, to put it another way, this identity of formlessness, this continuous unity of matter, is itself a formal determination. So the formlessness of matter is itself a form, and so the content and form become identical here. Hence we have to recognize that the matter that is here put on one side, it does itself belong to the other side, the side of form. But in that case, form is identical with itself too. It relates itself to itself, and in so doing has just the self-subsistence that is differentiated as matter. Yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Because insofar as form stands as something different from matter or content, it is subsistent, but that is the very definition of content. It is that which is the subsistent.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. The starting point for this syllogism, Kant continues, is the order and purposiveness that is observed in the world. There are purposive arrangements, and this connection between things which they do not themselves imply consequently serves as the starting point. By virtue of this, a tertium quid, a cause, is posited. From the purposiveness that we observe, we infer the existence of the author who is responsible for the purposiveness of the connections. So we cannot validly infer anything more than what, as far as content is concerned, is given in what is present, and concordant with the starting point. Now the purposive arrangements show themselves to be astonishingly great, highly excellent and wise, but a very great, a properly marvelous wisdom is not yet absolute wisdom. We recognize an extraordinary power in it, but that is not yet omnipotence. The leap to omnipotence, says Kant, is one that we are not entitled to take, so we have recourse to the ontological proofs, the one that starts from the concept of the most real being. But mere perception, which provides the starting point in the teleological proof, does not extend to this totality. God damn, man, like, that's a good critique. It's surprising, like, as an aside, I took a class once from this professor who was very staunchly atheistic and materialist, and he taught a class on philosophy of religion. Not a very good class, by the way. But the general arguments brought up were the usual arguments. Oh, well, the assumption of teleology, because that's with materialism the thing. Like, that's the thing that they go after, which is, oh, well, this doesn't really work as a proof of God because you're just assuming that there is a purpose anyways. And this is an even stronger argument because even if you give the Christian the benefit, okay, I'll give you the point of the teleology, you still can't prove God with it. All right, continuing. We must in any case grant that the starting point has a lesser content than what is arrived at. In the world there is only relative wisdom, not absolute wisdom. This should be examined more closely, however. We have here a syllogism. From one thing something else is inferred. From the way the world is constituted we infer an activity. Something that binds together the mutually extraneous existences. An activity that is their inner, their implicit potential, and which does not already reside immediately within them. The form of the inference gives rise to a false appearance, as though God had a foundation which provides our starting point. God appears as conditioned. The purposive ordering or arrangement is the condition, and the existence of God seems to be expressed as something mediated or conditioned. This is the particular objection that Jacobi has underlined, that the proof aims to attain to the unconditioned through conditions. But as we have already seen, this is only a false appearance, one that is sublated in the meaning of the conclusion itself. As far as this meaning is directly concerned, it will be granted that it, the proof, is only the process of subjective cognizing. The mediation in the process does not attach to God. There you go. So back to God's self. The mediation in the process does not attach to God, God's self. For God is indeed what is unconditioned, the infinite activity that determines itself according to its purposes and orders the world purposively. The argument does not imply that the conditions that provide our starting point are prior to this infinite activity. On the contrary, the whole process of subjective cognizing and the conclusion it arrives at is this, that it is God who posits these purposive arrangements, and that these are therefore from the beginning what is posited by God, and not the abiding foundation. The ground that we start from is itself undermined by what is defined as the authentic ground. This is the meaning of the syllogism, that what conditions can in its turn only be explained as what is conditioned. The conclusion expresses the fact that it was a defect to posit as foundation something that is itself conditioned. Thus this process is in fact, and in its climax, not just a subjective process, not something that is mired in thought. Instead, this defective aspect is itself eliminated by the conclusion. Thus, what is objective expresses itself even in the cognition. It is not merely an affirmative passing over, but it involves a negative moment, although that is not posited in the form of the inference. In this way, there is a mediation, that is, a negation of the first immediacy. The process of spirit is indeed a transition, a passing over to the activity that subsists in and for itself and posits purpose. But at the same time, it is implied by the process that the determinate existence of this purposive order is not to be taken for what is in and for itself. Only reason, only the activity of eternal reason, is what is in and for itself. The being of the purposive order observed in the world is not something authentic, but only the show or semblance of the eternal activity. Alright, I'm going to have to read this whole paragraph again because I kind of missed out what the exact point was. We must in any case grant that the starting point has a lesser content than what is arrived at. In the world there is only relative wisdom, not absolute wisdom. This should be examined more closely, however. We have here a syllogism: from one thing something else is inferred. From the way the world is constituted we infer an activity. Something that binds together the mutual extraneous existences, an activity that is their inner side, their implicit potential, in which it does not already reside immediately within them. Okay. The form of the inference gives rise to a false appearance, as though God had a foundation which provides our starting point. God appears as conditioned. The purposive ordering or arrangement is the condition, and the existence of God seems to be expressed as something mediated or conditioned. This is the particular objection that Jacobi has underlined, that the proof aims to attain to the unconditioned through conditions. Alright, so that argument seems to be that because our inferential activity or our cognition begins from the condition, this itself, the form of this proof itself, conditions God, the unconditioned, because the condition of finding the unconditioned is through the conditioned. And Jacobi seems to think that this is not valid.
He seems to, I think he'd be making almost like a regress case where it's like, if this thing's purposed to this thing, and that thing's purposed to this other thing, and so on, you have a series of conditions of purposes, rather than a purpose which determines the conditions of all those things at once.
That would be part of it, but I think that the main point is if you remember the cosmological proof, a similar issue came up there about like how there was a weak reading of the argument in which the necessary was itself contingent to the contingent, but the way that the syllogism is put forth doesn't actually say this. So the same thing is here, that just because of the form of the syllogism and the way that the way that it's structured, that if there is a contingent world, the way the world is constituted, we can infer an activity in that contingent world, something that binds together the mutually extraneous existences, an activity that is their inner side, their implicit potential, which does not already reside immediately in them. And this is purpose of activity. But if there are purposes, then there must be something that engages the purpose. So it's an external teleology, because the purpose is not immanent to the things; it comes external to them. So there must be some source to this purpose. And it seems that Jacobi's argument here is that the fact that we're going from finite purposes and the contingent somehow makes God himself, because that's the conditioned, and then we jump from the conditioned to the unconditioned. And somehow this is invalid to him, because then the unconditioned is conditioned to be known only through the conditioned, but it's the unconditioned. It should be knowable unconditionally, I suppose. It's a weird argument there. But as we have already seen, this is only a false appearance, one that is sublated in the meaning of the conclusion itself. As far as this meaning is directly concerned, it will be granted that the proof, is only the process of subjective cognizing. The mediation in the proof does not attach to God's self, for God is indeed what is unconditioned. The infinite activity determines itself according to its purposes and orders the world purposively. The argument does not imply that the conditions that provide our starting point are prior to this infinite activity. And actually related to this, I had a discussion yesterday, this morning, very early in the morning, like at 1 a.m., with somebody who, this is really relevant, because somebody who had this exact mindset, in which they could not understand how thought could be objective, because even if you could show that given any thought, that's an actual determinate thought, that there's a logical progression to what that thought can actually do and engage, and the way you must think it. But he could not get away from this standpoint of, this may be the case after I posit it, but it's still conditional to me positing it. So, this is only, the concept is ultimately only what it is by virtue that I subjectively think it as the thing that it is. And, giving any example of any concept, say a concept of a dog, whatever, he's like, well, yes, but, the dog doesn't exist until, unless I myself subjectively think the concept of the dog. And I'm like, that's not the point, because the whole point of conceptuality in Hegel is, it's not that we subjectively think things, whether we're thinking them or not. The structural nature of the world and the dynamics of it are there unconsciously. The dog doesn't need to conceptualize itself to be the thing that it is, and to be determinately doing and being the thing that it is in a determinate world. And we don't have to conceptually cognize the dog to be able to encounter it as an actual being, which then obviously when we subjectively engage the process of cognition, we will grasp the kind of concepts and determinations that are there. And yet again, they always went back to but this rests on the fact that I begin the process of cognition, and therefore ultimately all these concepts really rest upon, my subjective arbitrary cognition.
Yeah, exactly. They'd be saying that there's no necessity in their thought. Their thought is acting contingently, and so anything it puts there is basically erasable. It's arbitrary. It can't give itself an objective content.
Yeah, it was part of that, and it was the other part is just the inability of them to think that the world does have determinacies, which we don't have to be cognizant of, but they're there. And insofar as they're there, we when we become cognizant of them, they will have the structure that they do have. in concept. Very weird mindset. Don't know how people get into that. It actually, I don't know. I still don't understand why, because it led them to a strange Schellingian conclusion, and they don't know anything about Schelling, but they literally thought that a concept has a direct logical derivation all the way down through to empirical individuals, and so he made no distinctions between logical necessity and empirical contingent necessities. And this mainly came up because we had a small attempt at a discussion of whether capitalism requires slavery and racism and apartheid and all these things. And this person said, well, since it is the case that it happened, it's inherent to the concept. And I kept trying to make arguments against that, and it just didn't click for them. Because I tell them, okay, well, if you have the concept of a triangle, this does not then lead to any immediate instantiation of requirements that this triangle has to be, say, a wooden triangle, or a triangle drawn in the dirt, or a triangle in your imagination. It can be instantiated in all those forms, but there's no direct link between that concept and the empirical instantiations. And he wanted to say, and he did say, that no, there must be a direct link between the a priori triangle and the empirical triangles as direct consequences of it. Very bizarre. Anyways, tangent. Continuing. On the contrary, the whole process of subjective cognizing, the conclusion it arrives at is this: that it is God who posits these purposive arrangements, and that these are therefore from the beginning what is posited by God, and not the abiding foundation. The ground that we start from is itself undermined, by what is defined as the authentic ground. This is the meaning of the syllogism, that what conditions can in its turn only be explained as what is conditioned. The conclusion expresses the fact that it was a defect to posit as foundation something that is itself conditioned. Thus, this process is in fact and in its climax not just a subjective process, not something that is mired in thought. Instead, this defective aspect is itself eliminated by the conclusion. Thus, what is objective expresses itself even in cognition. It is not merely an affirmative passing over, but it involves a negative moment, although that is not posited in the form of the inference. In this way, there is a mediation that is the negation of the first immediacy. The process of spirit is indeed a transition, a passing over to the activity that subsists in and for itself and posits purpose. But at the same time, it is implied by the process that the determinate existence of this purposive order is not to be taken for what is in and for itself. The being of the purposive order, observed in the world, is not something authentic, but only the show or semblance of the eternal activity. All right, much clearer. There is, moreover, a distinction that must be made in the determination in terms of purpose between form and content. If we consider the form in its purity, we have a purposive being that is finite, and as far as the form is concerned, the finitude consists in the fact that the purpose and the means are distinct, the means being the material in which the purpose is realized. This is its finitude. Thus, for our purposes, we need a material. The activity is ours, and the material is something diverse. This is the finitude of purposive being, the finitude of form. But the truth of this relationship is not finite in this way. Sorry, just highlighting some stuff. The purpose accomplishes itself. It realizes itself through its own activity, and thus it closes with itself in the course of its execution. As we have seen, the finitude of purpose lies in the separateness of the means and the material. Where this obtains, the purpose is still a technical mode of operating. The truth of purposive determination, that is, the genuine case, is where the purpose contains its own means in itself and the material in which it accomplishes itself as well. In this case, the purpose is authentic in regard to form, for objective truth consists precisely in the correspondence of the concept to reality. The purpose is authentic only when the mediating activity and the means equally with the reality are all identical with the purpose. In that case, the purpose is present as what has reality in itself. It is not something subjective, one-sided, for which the moments are extraneous. This is the authentic case of purpose, whereas the purpose of connection in a finite situation is the inauthentic case. So the example for that is always organisms, in which the purpose is its own end, and the means are one with the purpose. The organism generates its own body from the beginning cells. These parts of the body articulate themselves into differentiated organs. These organs freely live their lives as part of this one unified being, serving their purpose towards its end, but the one unified being also serves the purpose of giving the conditions for the environment of the being of these organs as themselves living beings, at least in the case of multicellular organisms. And so these are not enslaved to something beyond them. Like they are one with the purpose. Their life serves a higher purpose, but they also are just living their life. And the one purpose that unifies them also in living its life provides for their living their lives. So it's a free relationship. We must remark at this point that purposive activity, the purposive connection as it has just been defined according to its truth, exists as something higher, even though at the same time it is present. We can no doubt say of it that it is the infinite, since it is a purposive activity that has its means and material in itself, but at the same time it is finite in another respect. This true case of purposive determination that we are seeking actually exists, even if only one-sidedly, in what is living or organic. Life as subject is the soul, and the soul is purposive. That is, it posits itself, it brings itself to fruition. So the product is the same as the productive activity. But what is living is an organism, and organs are means. The living soul implies a body, and only with that body does it constitute a whole, something actual. The organs are the means of life, and these means, the organs, are also that in which life comes to fruition and preserves itself. They are also the material. This is what self-preservation is. What is alive preserves itself. It is the beginning and the end. The product is also what starts the activity. What is living is, as such, always in activity. Need initiates activity and drives toward its satisfaction, but this is again the beginning of need. The living organism exists only to the extent that it is always a product. Here we have the truth of purpose in regard to form. The organs of what is living are means, but also end. In their activity they bring forth nothing but themselves. Each organ maintains the other and thereby maintains itself. This activity constitutes one purpose, one soul, or living principle that is present everywhere in the organism. Every part of the body has sensation. The soul is present in it. This is purposive activity in its authenticity. Pretty good. This example is always definitely one of the clearest in all of Hegel's examples for anything. But the living subject is also something finite through and through, so purposive activity has here a formal truth, but one that is not complete. What is alive produces itself. It contains in itself the material for its own emergence. Every organ secretes the animal lymph that is used by others to reproduce themselves. What is alive contains its material in itself, but this is only an abstract process. The finite aspect of it consists in the fact that while the organs are living off themselves, they need material from outside. Everything organic is in an active relation to inorganic nature, which is out there as something independent. In one respect, the organism is infinite, since it forms a circuit of pure return into itself, but there is at the same time a tension between it and the external inorganic nature. It has needs. The means for meeting these needs come from outside. Human beings need air, light, and water. They also consume animals and other living things, which they thereby make into inorganic nature, into a means. It is the circumstance in particular that leads us to assume a higher unity, that is, the harmony in which the means correspond to the end. This harmony does not live within the subject itself, yet as we have seen, the harmony that constitutes organic life is within the subject. The whole structure of the organ is the circulatory and nervous system. The intestines, the lungs, liver, stomach, etc., is marvelously concordant, but does not this harmony itself require something else extraneous to the subject? We can leave this question aside, for if one grasps the concept of the organism as we have presented it, this development of the purposive determination itself necessarily follows from the mere fact of the subject's being alive, and if this concept were not grasped, what is living would no longer be the concrete unity that we have defined it to be. And then in order to understand unity, one has recourse to conceptions involving external mechanical processes in the circulation of the blood, or chemical processes for the decomposition of foodstuffs. But processes of this kind cannot render an exhaustive account of what life itself is, so that a tertium quid must be assumed which has established these processes. But in fact, this unity, this harmony of the organism, is precisely the subject. This unity, however, also involves the active relation of the living subject to external nature, which has only a contingent, indifferent being vis-a-vis the subject. All right, pretty clear so far. The conditions involved in this relationship are not developed by the living thing itself. Yet if it did not find them already present, it could not exist. The consideration of this immediacy brings with it the feeling of something higher, something that has established this harmony, and this at once arouses human emotion and wonder too. Every animal has its own small range of foodstuffs. Indeed, many animals are restricted to a single food. This is another respect in which human nature is the most general. The fact that this external, quite peculiar condition holds for every animal arouses humanity to an astonishment that passes over into a high veneration for that third being, in addition to nature in the human subject, which has posited this unity. This reverent wonder is the elevation of humanity to this higher being that brings forth the necessary conditions for its own purpose. The subject is actively concerned with its own preservation. This active concern is present, though unconscious, in every living being. It is what we call instinct in the animal. One animal secures its own maintenance by violence, another produces it by ingenuity. This is the wisdom of God in nature, in which this infinite multiplicity of activities and conditions necessary for our particular forms is encountered. When we consider the particular ways in which living beings are active, we see that they are something contingent. They are not posited by the subject itself, but require an external cause. In the life principle, only the general principle of self-preservation is posited, but living beings differ in an infinitude of particular ways, and this particular variety is posited by another. But the question is this: how is inorganic nature adapted to the organic? How does it come to be capable of serving as the means for organic life? Here we encounter a view of the matter that grasps this coincidence in a distinctive fashion. Animals are inorganic vis-a-vis human beings, and plants are inorganic vis-a-vis animals. But the nature that is inorganic in itself, such as the sun, moon, and whatever appears as a means, or as matter generally, is initially immediate. It is already there before the organic. Consequently, the relationship is so constituted that the inorganic is independent, while the organic, by contrast, is what is dependent. The inorganic, which is here termed the immediate, is the unconditioned. Okay. Well. How is inorganic nature adapted to the organic? How does it come to be capable of serving as the means for organic life? So animals are inorganic vis-a-vis human beings, inorganic versus animals. Okay, continuing. Inorganic nature appears as self-sufficient. Plants, animals, and humans are added to it afterward from outside. The earth could subsist without vegetation, the vegetable kingdom without animals, and the animal kingdom without humans. Hence, these different aspects appear to be independent from one another. We appeal to experience in support of this too. There are mountains without any vegetation and without animal or human life. The moon has no atmosphere. There is, by the way, that's false. The moon does have an atmosphere, in case you did not know. It actually has clouds. It's pretty weird.
I did not know that there's clouds on the moon.
Yes. I'll show you a video later. It's pretty weird. There is moon has no atmosphere. There is on it no meteorological process such as provides the necessary conditions for vegetation, so it subsists without any vegetation, and there are other similar examples. Something inorganic of this kind appears to be self-subsistent. Humanity is an extraneous addition to it. So we come to the view that nature is inwardly a productive power that produces blindly, from which issues forth vegetation. Out of vegetation there springs the animal world, and at last all of humanity with its thinking consciousness. In any case, we can say that nature produces stages, among which each one is always the condition for the next one. Definitely want to see this argument. But if organic life and humanity are contingent accretions of this kind, the question that arises is whether human beings will or will not find what is necessary there ready for them. According to this view, this will likewise be a matter of chance, since on this view there is no unity that is valid on its own account. Aristotle already suggests the same opinion. Nature produces living beings continually, and the question then is whether they can exist. Whether one of them can maintain itself is wholly a matter of chance. Thus nature has already conducted an infinite number of experiments and has produced a whole host of monsters. Many myriads of configurations have emerged from it, but they were not able to survive. Their disappearance, however, was of no importance. As evidence to prove this assertion, we are referred especially to the remains of monsters that are still to be found here and there. These genera perished, so it is assumed, because the conditions necessary for their existence had ceased to obtain. In this way, the concordance of the organic and the inorganic is what is established as contingent. There is no need to ask for a unity, and the very fact of purposiveness is explained as contingent. The conceptual determinations involved here, therefore, are the following. Speaking generally, what we call inorganic nature as such is represented on its own account as self-subsistent, while the organic is represented as an external accretion, so that it is a matter of chance whether it finds in what stands over against it the necessary conditions for its existence. We must take note here that the forms of the conceptual determination, inorganic nature, is what is first and immediate. It also matches the childlike sense of the Mosaic age, that heaven and earth, light, etc. were created first and the organic emerged later in time. The question is whether this is the authentic way of defining the concept of the inorganic, and whether living beings and a humanity are what is dependent. Against this view, philosophy exhibits the truth involved in the determination of the concept. But even without that, human beings are in no doubt that they are actively related to the rest of nature as its end or purpose, and that nature has only the role of means vis-a-vis humanity, for this is the role of the inorganic generally, vis-a-vis the organic. In formal terms, the organic is in itself what is purposive. It is both means and end, and so it is implicitly something infinite. Sorry about that. It is both means and end, and so it is implicitly something infinite. It is purpose returning into itself, and even on the side of its external dependence, it is defined as purpose. Therefore, it is what is genuinely first as against what has been termed the immediate, that is, as against nature. This immediacy is only a one-sided determination and must be downgraded to being only something posited. The genuine relationship is this. Humanity is not an accidental accretion upon what comes first. On the contrary, what comes first is, for the organic, itself, and the inorganic has only the semblance of being in regard to it. This relationship is logically developed in science itself. Let me reread that. All right. The question of whether this is the authentic way of defining the concept of the inorganic, and whether living beings and humanity are what is dependent. Against this view, philosophy exhibits the truth involved in the determination of the concept. But even without that, human beings are in no doubt that they are actively related to the rest of nature as its end or purpose, and that nature has only the role of means vis-a-vis humanity, for this is the role of the inorganic generally vis-a-vis the organic. In formal terms, the organic is in itself what is purposive. It is both means and end, and so it is implicitly something infinite. It is purpose returning into itself, and even on the one side of its external dependence, it is defined as purpose. Therefore, it is what is genuinely first as against what has been termed the immediate, that is, as against nature. This immediacy is only a one-sided determination and must be downgraded to being only something posited. Okay, makes sense. For people who aren't Hegelian, I totally understand, and Hegel also here understands why this wouldn't make sense to them. It has to do with the way in which the logic of absoluteness actually works. So in the sense that matter is immediate, and it's revealed to be mediated by living beings, because living beings take the inorganic, form it into their bodies, and then transform it into whatever it is that their body needs. We eat food, and that food gets transformed to sugars and carbs and all these other things. Well, carbs are sugar, aren't they? It's just a different kind of sugar. Sugars, fats, all lipids, which then get broken down to energies of different kinds, like ATP, which then get consumed by cells, and then these, in their own life process, do their life activity, and then there's a total shared life activity. And then the whole process is posited all over again, ecologically. The individuals only share one little bit of that chain, but ecologically, the whole cycle from the inorganic to the organic happens. And it is upkept by the living side of the cycle, and not the inorganic side, really. So anything that can be mediated cannot actually be the absolute. So here, inorganic nature cannot be the absolute, and therefore cannot be the principle upon which we either base our ontological understanding or our purpose of understanding. Continuing. But in this relationship, we still have separation. The fact that the organic involves, on one side, an external relatedness to inorganic nature, instead of inorganic nature being posited implicitly in the organic itself. The living being develops from the seed, and development is the action of the members, the inner organs, etc. The soul is the unity that brings forth this action. Here too, however, the truth of organic and inorganic nature is only the essential connection between the two, their unity and inseparability. This unity is a third term, which is neither the one nor the other, and the absolute category that unites the organic and the inorganic is not to be found in immediate existence. The subject is what is organic, and the other term appears as object, but then it changes into the predicate of the organic and becomes posited as belonging to it. This is the reciprocity of this connection. The two terms are posited in one, within each of them is something dependent and conditioned. In general terms, we can call this third term to which consciousness raises itself God. But a great deal is still lacking from the concept of God. But it is a great deal. Hold on there. In general terms, we can call this third term to which consciousness raises itself God. But a great deal still is lacking from the concept of God. God is, in this sense, the activity of production, which is a judgment or primal division, through which the two sides are both produced together. In this one concept, they fit together, they are for one another. Something interesting. So if Hegel's making this argument that we cannot take that Aristotelian view that, well, okay, fine, life is possible, but it's still contingent, and ultimately the ultimate condition is the contingent arrangement of matter into certain things. And Hegel here says no. And this is something that it seems to me most Hegelians today deny. I know Winfield seems to deny this, because Winfield, whenever I've heard him talk about this, has put forth that Aristotelian notion that life itself is contingent as happening in nature. That, it's just like, well, certain matters are here and over there, and they happen to arrange themselves into the proper unity at this place and not at this other place, and that is contingent. And it seems to me Hegel is making this, the strong claim that the arising of life anywhere at all is not itself contingent either. Or am I misreading that too strongly, do you think?
I'm not sure. It's been a while. Or I think you're reading Hegel, right? I'm not sure about Winfield. It's been a little while since I looked at his book.
Yep. We are therefore quite right in emphasizing that the truth of the purpose of relation is this third term as we have just defined it. But this only defines the third term formally on the basis of what it is the truth of. It is itself living activity. But this is still not spirit or rational action. The correspondence of the concept as the organic to reality as the inorganic is nothing but the meaning of life itself. More specifically, this is what the ancients called, I assume that's nous. The world is a harmonic whole and organic life that is determined according to purposes. I don't know what the hell Vuk is. This was what the ancients understood by... Oh, okay, I assume that these were supposed to be the actual original Greek letters, and whoever ripped this, it didn't copy over properly. Another way of defining it was as the world's soul, or something Greek. All that is posited by this is vitality, or the life principle. It is not yet posited that the world's soul is distinct from its life principle as spirit. The soul is the life principle in the organic and no more. It is not something sundered from the body, something material, but is the life force that permeates the body. For this reason, Plato called God an immortal something, that is, an eternal living principle. He did not get beyond this category of life principle. All right, so we've gotten to life. It's probably a good place to do a recap. We started with the issue of the teleological argument, which is the issue of purpose. We went away from the way in which it's framed as people interpret it as finite purposes, to the point in which we talk about clearly God has to be an infinite purpose. But an infinite purpose is something which is self-purposes, and that's why the whole discussion of life has come into it. But life is still not yet so we are therefore quite right in emphasizing the truth of the purposive relation is this third term, as we have just defined it. But this only defines the third term formally on the basis of what it is in truth. It is itself living activity, but this is still not spirit or rational action. So the concept of life is not good enough for the concept of God, basically. When we grasp the life principle in its truth, we find that it is one principle, one organic life of the universe, one living system. There we go. These are the metaphysical things that drive many people crazy, because they're like, the universe is a living thing? What? Everything that is constitutes the organs of the one subject. The planets that revolve around the sun are only giant members of this one system. Thus, the universe is not an aggregate made up of many mutually indifferent accidents, but a system based on the principle of life. This account, however, still does not involve the positing of the category of spirit. The way this metaphorically, the way this makes sense to me is that you look out into the universe, and to the sky, and what you see is actually a very well ordered system, which seems to have some kind of self-productive and long-living capacities. But and we don't think about these as organisms, but I mean, quite literally, the fact that these are self-organizing and self-perpetuating systems is pretty organic. And this is not just on the level of planets. This is on the level of solar systems. This is on the levels of local clusters, nebulas, all these other things, and galaxies. And even within amongst galaxies, there are galaxy clusters and the relationships between them. There are not only it's gravitic relationships. There are also direct electrical relationships. People don't know about this, by the way. There are these huge, unbelievably huge plasma bridges from galaxy to galaxy, and they're doing something. I think there's some observations have been made about how much current runs through these things between them, and nobody knows exactly what they're doing. We just know that they're there, and obviously they seem to form a part of the galactic environment, which then one could say also forms part of the internal galactic environments and many other things. Very interesting. We have now to consider the formal side of the purposive relation. The other side is that of content. Here the question is, what are the determinations of the divine purpose, or what is the content of the purpose that is realized, or how are these determined purposes constituted with respect to what was called wisdom? As regards the content, the starting point is again what is found ready in experience. Okay, a question. So let me just read this whole little paragraph. When we grasp the life principle in its truth, we find that it is one principle, one organic life of the universe, one living system. Everything that is constitutes the organs of the one subject. The planets that revolve around the sun are only giant members of this one system. Thus, the universe is not an aggregate made up of many mutually indifferent accidents, but a system based on the principle of life. This account, however, still does not involve the positing of the category of spirit. So, life is a purposive principle, but it is not a consciously purposive principle. Like it's not a freely purposive principle, and spirit is particularly a free purposive being. So the account of the absolute in this case as just the totality of the living being of the universe as such is not good enough to account for God in this case, because at least from Hegel's standpoint, it is already given that God is spirit. God is not merely life. Let me continue. We have now considered the formal side of the purposive relation. The other side is that of content. Here the question is, what are the determinations of the divine purpose, or what is the content of the purpose that is realized, or how are these determined purposes constituted with respect to what is called wisdom? As regards the content, the starting point is again what is found ready in experience. We start from immediate being. It is consideration of the purposes in this empirical light, as they are found in experience, that has been largely responsible for the teleological proof being set on one side, and indeed for its being looked down on with contempt. We talk of the wise orderings of nature. As determinate forms of organic life, the manifoldly various types of animal life are finite, and the external means to support all this life are present. The living forms are the goal. If we ask then what constitutes the inner substance of the goal, the answer is that it is nothing but the preservation of these insects, these animals, etc. We can indeed rejoice about their vitality, but the necessity of their being as they are is a very inadequate or representational type of necessity. It is a pious way of looking at it to say that God has arranged it all thus. It exalts the mind of God, but what is represented in regard to God is an absolute infinite purpose, and these petty purposes contrast sharply with what is found in regard to God. When we survey the higher spheres and consider the human purposes that we can regard as being relatively the highest, we find that for the most part they are stultified and perish without issue. In nature, millions of seeds perish in their seed phase without germinating to develop into a living organism. For the most part, everything alive lives basically upon the death or decay of other life. Ooh. It's a tough one. It is the same story with the higher purposes. If we traverse the field of ethical life to its highest stage, that of the life of the state, and observe whether the purposes are fulfilled or not, we shall, to be sure, find that many of them are fulfilled, but that still more, including the greatest and noblest, are stultified and brought to grief by human passions and vices. Ah, man, where's a certain someone with something like this is relevant?
All right.
We see the earth covered with ruins, with the remains of the splendid buildings and monuments of the noblest peoples, those whose goals we recognize as essential. Great natural objects and human artifacts do indeed endure and defy time, but the glorious life of those peoples has perished irrevocably. Thus, on the one side, we see petty, subordinate, even despicable purposes fulfilled. On the other side, those which we recognize as essential come to grief. When we deplore the ill fortune and the perishing of so much that is excellent, we must in any event ascend to a higher category and a higher purpose. However much they interest us, we must regard all these purposes as finite and subordinate, and ascribe the destruction that has befallen them to their finitude. But the universal purpose we have to consider here is not to be found in experience, and this radically alters the character of the transition in the argument. Oh man, this is getting really interesting.
Yeah, he's on fire in this section. This is all so interesting, top to bottom.
For we started our argument from what is already present, we drew a conclusion from what we find in experience. But what we encounter in experience has a character of limitedness. The highest purpose is the good, the universal final goal of the world, and reason has to regard this as the absolute final goal of the world, the purpose that is directly grounded in the category of reason, the purpose beyond which spirit itself cannot go. And the source in which this purpose is recognized is thinking reason. This purpose, moreover, shows itself to be fulfilled in the world, but the good is what is determined in and for itself by reason, and nature stands over against it, physical nature on the one hand, which goes its own way and has its own laws, but also the natural aspect of humanity, with all the private purposes that run counter to the good. When we appeal to perception, we can see that there is much good in the world, but also an infinite amount of evil. And one would, of course, have to account the sum of the evil and of the good that does not come to its own fruition in order to learn which has the upper hand. However, it is of the very essence of the good to be. It pertains to it essentially that it should be realized. But it only ought to be actual, for it does not demonstrate itself in experience. It remains a postulate and does not get beyond what ought to be. And since the good has not of itself the power to realize itself, a tertium quid is postulated through which the final goal of the world will be actualized. This is an absolute postulate. What is morally good is the affair of human beings. But since their power is only finite and the good in them is limited by their natural aspect, humanity is itself the enemy of the good and is therefore incapable of actualizing itself. Alright, so here's the argument against the good being reliant upon us. The existence of God is represented in this moral argument merely as a postulate, an ought which should have subjective certainty for human beings because the good is the ultimate category in their reason. But this certainty is only subjective. It remains just a faith, an ought, and it cannot be demonstrated that it is actually the case. In fact, if the good as such is to be an actually present moral good, it has got to be postulated and presupposed that the disharmony will be everlasting. For the morally good can only subsist, it only has its being in the battle against evil. Thus the everlasting activity of the enemy, or of what is opposed to the good, is a postulate too. Alright, so going over this, so the good is that which is the ultimate end of things. When we make the good only a subjective principle, we oppose it to the evil. It's a moral principle. One, there's equally as much evil. Well, there's a lot of evil and good in the world. The very essence of the good is to be. It pertains to it essentially that it should be realized. So we said it as a moral principle. But it only ought to be actual, for it does not demonstrate itself in experience. So, because if it was an experience, then it would be. It wouldn't be the ought to be. It remains a postulate and does not get beyond what ought to be. And since the good has not itself the power to realize itself, a tertium quid is postulated through which the final goal of the world will be actualized. So, the good ought to be, but the good is this disembodied rational principle, and so it needs an agent in the world. This agent then is us. This is an absolute postulate. What is morally good is the affair of human beings, but since their power is only finite and the good in them is limited by their natural aspect, humanity is itself the enemy of the good and is therefore incapable of actualizing itself. So humans are the agents of the good, but humans themselves are natural and finite beings, and nature is irrational, and to be finite is evil. This is something that comes up in other places in Hegel. So humans, in being finite and having natural given inclinations, which they may or may not overcome, are themselves an evil against the good. The existence of God is represented in this moral argument merely as a postulate and ought which should have subjective certainty for human beings, because the good is the ultimate category in their reason. But this certainty is only subjective. It remains just a faith and ought, and it cannot be demonstrated that it is actually the case. So the certainty, which is the certainty of reason, the subjective certainty for human beings of the ought, cannot be demonstrated that it is actually the case. I assume this, I interpret this as kind of overtaking both the logical and the empirical aspect, which, someone who thinks of the good in this way wouldn't be able to think of the good as an absolute, so they could not show it to be rationally the case that the good is actually good, or what ought to be. And it's also the case that empirically then they also can't, because they think it ought to be, it clearly isn't. So it couldn't be demonstrated either way. In fact, if the good as such is to be an actually present moral good, it has got to be postulated and presupposed that a disharmony will be everlasting. For the morally good can only subsist, it only has its being in the battle against evil. Thus the everlasting activity of the enemy, or of what is opposed to the good, is a postulate too. Here it's not clear.
Oh, I think the idea here is that if the good is what ought to be, and therefore is always distinct from what is, then in order for us to be acting the good, we always have to presuppose that what is evil. And so it's a necessary part of realizing the good. So it has to keep everlastingly positing evil, or saying that evil is what is. So it can be opposed by what ought to be.
Okay, yeah, that's a good interpretation. That makes sense. Yeah, because then that goes along with what I was thinking about it right now also, which is that even if it is given that you bring what ought to be as what is, there's an everlasting struggle to maintain it as being. So it never fully is. It always has the element of that it ought to be, and people have to actively be bringing the ought into the is. When we return to the content, therefore, we find that it is limited, and we pass on to the highest purpose. We find ourselves in a different domain. Here the starting point is internal. We do not start from what is present in experience. If, on the contrary, the only starting point is experience, then the good, the final goal, is itself just something subjective, and the contradiction between the other side and the good has necessarily to last forever. All right. That was a bit abrupt, but it still was pretty succinct and clear at the end. That wraps it up. That was the teleological proof. How much time do we have? Okay, the ontological proof is only like about 10 pages, I think. Yeah, you guys just want to finish that?
Yeah, we could definitely do the ontological, I think.
All right, here's my favorite proof. The Ontological Proof, from the 1831 Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion. The first thing to be considered in the sphere of the revelatory religion is the abstract concept of God. The basis is the free, pure, revelatory concept. God's manifestation, God's being for an other, is God's determinate being or existence, and the soil of God's determinate being is finite spirit. This is the second thing to be considered. Finite spirit and finite consciousness are concrete. The main point in regard to this religion is to be recognized in this process, that God manifests God's self in finite spirit and is identical with God's self in it. The identity of the concept with determinate being is the third thing to be considered. Properly speaking, identity is here a misleading expression, for what is essentially involved is organic life within God. Determinate being is the second concept of the science of logic. In the new translation, it's translated as existence, which makes more sense to me, really. It flows well with what we tend to mean with a general notion of existence, as opposed to a more concrete notion, which would be like there's something in the Logic of Essence, which is called concrete existence. I'm not sure what concept that's related to. I haven't looked. And then there's also that, and that concept is more related to what we talk about also when we talk about existence as existence out there. You know, somebody asks you, does Bigfoot exist? And you're like, well, obviously not. Well, if they're talking about, does Bigfoot exist as an objective entity out there? I don't know, maybe. No good evidence on that. But does Bigfoot exist as a concept? And people said, hell yeah, it's an old mythos. And that is existence. That is an existence like anything else. In the previous forms, we have had an ascending, a starting from a determinate being characterized in various ways. In the one case, being was characterized in the most comprehensive way as contingent being. In the cosmological proof, the truth of contingent being is being that is in and for itself necessary. Determinate being was also characterized as containing within itself purposive relations, and this yielded the teleological proof. Here there is an ascending, a starting from a presently given determinate being. So these proofs fall under the finite aspect of the definition of God. But the concept of God is what is boundless, not boundless in the bad sense, but rather as what is at the same time most determinate, pure self-determination. Those first proofs fall on the side of a finite coherence or a finite determination, inasmuch as the starting point is something given. Here, on the contrary, the starting point is the free, pure concept. So it is at this stage that the ontological proof of God's existence comes in. This proof constitutes the abstract metaphysical foundation of this stage, and was first discovered in Christianity by Anselm of Canterbury. It is then adduced in all later philosophers, Descartes, Leibniz, Wolff, but always alongside the other proofs, though it is the only genuine one. I completely 100% agree and validate this. The ontological proof has the concept as its starting point. The concept is regarded as something subjective and characterized as opposed to the object and to reality. Here the concept is the beginning, and what matters is to show that being also pertains to this concept. In more detail, the argument runs as follows. The concept of God is set up, and it is shown that it cannot be grasped except as including being within itself. To the extent that being is distinguished from the concept exists only subjectively, in our own thinking. As thus subjective, it is what is imperfect, what falls only within finite spirit. That it is not just our concept, but also is, irrespective of our thinking, has to be demonstrated. Anselm states the proof in the following simple form. God is what is most perfect, beyond which nothing can be thought. If God is mere representation, God is not what is perfect, but this is to contradict the first premise, for we deem as perfect that which is not just representation, but which possesses being as well. If God is only subjective, we can adduce something higher, possessed of being as well. This has then been further elaborated as follows. We begin with what is most perfect, defined as the most real being. The sum total of all realities. This has been called possibility, the concept as subjective, inasmuch as it is distinguished from being as the merely possible concept, or it should at least be possible. According to traditional logic, possibility is found only where no contradiction can be exhibited. On this view, realities are to be apprehended in God only in their most affirmative aspect, without any restrictions, or in such a way that negation is to be left aside. Sorry. It can easily be demonstrated that all that is then left is the abstraction of what is one with itself. For when we speak of realities, we mean different characteristics such as wisdom, justice, omnipotence, omniscience, and these properties are properties that can easily be exhibited as standing in contradiction to one another. Goodness is not justice. Absolute power runs counter to wisdom, for wisdom presupposes purposes, while power is totally unrestricted in its negating productive activity. So if, according to the stipulation, the concept is to be self-contradictory, is not to be self-contradictory, all determinacy must fall away, for every difference is driven into an opposition. God, so we say, is the sum total of all realities. Being is also one form of reality, so being is inseparably bound with the concept. So in what ways would goodness be opposed to justice? What I can think of is mercy, right? Clemency. You could be merciful to someone and not give them what they deserve, or not punish them as they deserve. You can forgive them, and forgiveness is good. But justice is good in this case as well. But somehow we there is a sense in which being able to forgive and forgiving someone puts you at a higher standard than just going by what is the objective social relationships of justice that we have. So that kind of makes sense in that sense, I think. Power running counter to wisdom, definitely. Absolute power doesn't necessarily involve wisdom, and wisdom also doesn't necessarily involve absolute power. He says wisdom presupposes purposes, while power does not. So that makes sense. This proof has survived down to recent times. We find it expounded in a particularly circumstantial fashion in Mendelssohn's Morgenstunden. Spinoza defines the concept of God as that which cannot be conceived without being. The finite is that whose existence does not correspond to its concept. The genus is realized in existent individuals, but they are ephemeral. The genus is the universal on its own account, so its existence does not correspond to the concept. In the inwardly determined infinite, on the other hand, the reality must correspond to the concept, for this is the idea, the unity of subject and object. This proof was criticized by Kant. His objection is as follows. If God is defined as the sum total of all realities, this does not include being, for being is not a reality. It makes no difference to the concept whether it is or is not. It remains the same. Even in Anselm's day, the same point was made by a monk. As he put it, what I represent to my shoes does not yet exist simply on that account. Kant maintains that 100 thalers remain of themselves the same thing whether I merely imagine them or have them. This means that being is not a reality, for it does not add anything to the concept. It may be conceded that being is not a predicate. What is required, however, is not indeed to add anything to the concept. At any rate, to call each and every miserly existent a concept is already a distortion, but to remove from it rather the shortcoming of being only subjective, of not being the idea. The concept that is only something subjective separate from being is a nullity. In the form of the proof as Anselm gives it, infinitude consists precisely in not being something one-sided or merely subjective, to which being would not belong. The understanding holds being and concept rigidly apart, each as self-identical, but even according to the ordinary view, the concept devoid of being is something one-sided and untrue, just as being in which there is no concept is too, the being that is devoid of concept. This antithesis that is found in infinitude can in no way This antithesis that is found in infinitude can in no wise occur in what is infinite, God. That's a strange use of the word wise. Makes sense,
that's common. Yeah, it's like saying in no way, in no wise.
Yeah, that's what I was assuming. Even without the connection to ways, it still makes sense, but it's just like it's not a common use, at least not in the things I encounter.
It's an old term. Or phrase.
But there is, yeah, okay. Continuing. But there is the following circumstance in this case, which makes the proof unsatisfactory. That most perfect and most real of all things is a presupposition, and being and the concept on their own account are one-sided when measured against it. Alright, so the problem is that we presuppose that God is that all-encompassing entity. Descartes and Spinoza define God as self-caused, causa sui. God's concept and existence are identical, or in other words, God cannot be grasped as concept apart from being. What is unsatisfactory is that this is a presupposition, so that when measured against it, the concept must of necessity be something subjective. But the finite and subjective is not something finite as measured against that presupposition. It is It is finite in itself, and hence it is the antithesis of itself. It is the unresolved contradiction. Being is supposed to be diverse from the concept. We believe that we can regard the concept as strictly subjective, as finite, but the determinate quality of being is in the concept itself. The finitude of subjectivity is sublated in the concept itself, and the unity of being and concept is not a presupposition vis-à-vis the concept against which it is measured. Alright, so from the side of being, or which would be finite if opposed to the concept, it itself shows itself to be finite and to require something more, so it's not a self-subsistent. And that something more is where, at least in Hegel's logic, it gets resolved into the concept. So for Hegel, in as much as Hegel has shown this to be the case, if one works through the science of logic, this is not a presupposition. The unity of being and the concept is not a presupposition at all, but it is actually a conclusion and result of the failure of being to be absolute. Being in its immediacy is contingent. We have seen that its truth is necessity. In addition, the concept necessarily includes being. Being is simple relation to self, the absence of mediation. The concept, if we consider it, is that in which all distinction has been absorbed, or in which all categorical determinations are present only in an ideal way. This ideality is sublated mediation, sublated differentiatedness, perfect clarity, pure transparency in being present to self. The freedom of the concept is absolute self-relatedness, the identity that is also immediacy, unity devoid of mediation. Thus the concept contains being implicitly. It consists precisely in the sublating of its own one-sidedness. When we believe we have separated being from the concept, this is only our opinion. When Kant says that reality cannot be plucked out of the concept, then the concept is there being grasped as finite. But the finite is what it sublates itself, and when we were supposed to be treating the concept as separate from being, what we had was the self-relatedness that is implicit in being itself. However, the concept does not only have being within itself implicitly. It is not merely what we have this insight. It is not merely that we have this insight, but that the concept is also being explicitly. It sublates its subjectivity itself and objectifies itself. Human beings realize their purposes. That is, what was at first only ideal is stripped of its one-sidedness and thereby made into a subsisting being. The concept is always dispositing of being as identical with itself. In intuiting, feeling, etc., we are confronted by external objects, but we take them up within us, so that they become ideal in us. What the concept does is to sublate its differentiation. When we look closely at the nature of the concept, we see that its identity with being is no longer a presupposition, but a result. What happens is that the concept objectifies itself, makes itself reality, and thus becomes the truth. The unity of subject and object. God, says Plato, is an immortal living entity whose body and soul are posited together, and those who separate the two sides have not advanced beyond the finite and the untrue. Based. Our present standpoint is that of Christianity. Here we have the concept of God in all its freedom. For this concept is identical with being, which is the poorest of all abstractions. No concept is so poor as to not have this determination in it. We do not have to consider being in the poverty of its abstraction or in false immediacy, but as the being of God, as wholly concrete being, distinct from God. The consciousness of finite spirit is the concrete being, the material in which the concept of God is realized. We are not here talking about any adding of being to the concept or about a simple unity of concept and being. Expressions like that are misleading. The unity in question is to be grasped rather as an absolute process, as the living activity of God, but in such a way that both sides are also differentiated in it, so that it is the absolute activity of eternally producing itself. We have here the concrete representation of God as spirit. The concept of spirit is the concept that has being in and for itself or knowledge. This infinite concept is negative relation to self. Related negatively to itself, it becomes the process of dividing and differentiating itself. But what has been thus distinguished, though it may at first appear as something external, devoid of spirit, extra divine, is identical with the concept. Absolute truth consists in the development of this idea. In the Christian religion, it is known that God has revealed God's self, and the very being of God consists in revealing God's self. Revealing is self-distinguishing. What has been revealed is precisely that God is revelatory. Okay. Just looking over this a bit quickly. We do not have to consider being in the poverty of its abstraction or in false immediacy, but as the being of God, as wholly concrete being distinct from God. The consciousness of finite spirit is the concrete being, the material in which the concept of God is realized. Here we are not talking about anything adding to being, the concept about simple unity, the concept, So, insofar as God concretely is, or that is exists, he exists as spirit, which is finite spirit is like would be us individuals. Religion must be for all of humanity, for those who have so purified their thinking that they know what is present, in the pure element of thinking, for those who have attained to speculative cognition of what God is, as well as for those who have not advanced beyond feeling and representation. So there you go. Religion is universal to everybody. Humanity does not just exist as pure thinking. Instead, thinking itself is manifested as intuiting, as representing. Hence, the absolute truth, as revealed to human beings, must also be present for them as representational, intuitive beings, as beings engaged in feeling and sensation. This is the form that distinguishes religion in general from philosophy. Philosophy thinks that what otherwise only is for representation and intuition. Philosophy thinks what otherwise only is, for representation and intuition. Like the representational intuitive thinking only has the immediacy of God to them, but they don't have the understanding or the concept of God. In representing, human beings are also thinking, and the content of truth comes to them as thinking beings. Only what things can have religion, and thinking includes... Only what things can have religion, and thinking includes representing. But it is only thinking that is the free form of truth. The understanding is also a form of thinking, but does not advance beyond the identity. Concept is concept, and being is being. These categories always keep this one-sided form for it. Whereas in truth, these finite forms do not count as independently self-identical simply because they are. On the contrary, they are only moments of a totality. Those who are angry with philosophy for thinking religion... Those who are angry with philosophy for thinking religion do not know what they are asking. Hatred and envy are both at work here under the outward show of humility. True humility consists in sinking one's spirit in the truth, in what is most inward, and having the object and nothing but the object in oneself. In this way, everything subjective that is still present as sensation disappears. Our task is to consider the idea from a purely speculative standpoint and justify it against the understanding that rebels against every content for religion in general. Any such content is said to be a mystery because it is concealed from the understanding. The understanding does not attain to the process that is this unity, so that the whole range of speculation is for it a mystery. This harkens back to what Hegel says in other places, where he says that what is generally called mysticism is the realm of speculative or speculation. And it's a mystery only to the understanding, because the understanding cannot rise to reason, which can grasp the dialectic as a dialectic, being what it truly is. And that's the only mystery in mysticism for Hegel. The mystery in which people fail to think or don't think about it is not mysticism as such. It's just a superficial mysticism. Oh, well. Okay. That was it.
The way that concluded, it's almost like that's supposed to be an introduction.
Yeah. Well, so it was, because this was an excerpt from the lectures on the philosophy of religion.
So there would have been further.
Yeah, there would have been further elaboration. But this was all that apparently was concerning this issue. Okay, well, it's kind of disappointing that he didn't have that much to say. But at the same time, there really isn't much to say about the ontological proof. It's the one that people have the most trouble with. Because I've literally met a few atheists. I had all the professors I had that in philosophy were atheists. Besides the dogmatic materialist and hardcore mental atheists, there was one that was trained analytically but specialized in classics. And she once said that She doesn't buy the ontological argument, but she could not explain what was wrong with it.
That's not uncommon. Either people go with Kant, or they go with that one famous reply about the most perfect island or whatever. Or the third, they usually go, something's wrong, but I don't know what's wrong in the argument. Those are the most common responses.
Yep, because I mean, if you understand the concept, it holds true. And Hegel's main critique of it is just like, well, it presupposes the concept of God, and it presupposes the concept of being. But it is right to say that they must come together. But it cannot prove this. Although if you buy the presuppositions, it works, and most people actually do buy it. In fact, I would say virtually everybody buys it, and when they understand it, the only thing they could say is like, "There's something wrong with this, but I don't know what." But anyways, we made it to the end. We finished this entire set of lectures. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen and gentlewomen, and for those of you who listen out there who are of different nationalities and ethnicities and different genders which don't exist in the English language, because we are a bunch of dualist, minimalist people in the Anglosphere. I hope you found this useful and interesting. We'll see what we finish next, but like we should do a little bit of like what Stalin did, where the party claps and you also clap for yourself. But all right, for those listening, see you next time.